Hey everybody, this is Unit 3 Cultural Patterns and Processes. So our Unit 3 big ideas are patterns in spatial organization, how does where people live, and what resources they have access to impact their cultural practices. Our impacts and interactions, how does the interaction of people contribute to the spread of cultural practices? And then finally, spatial patterns and societal change, how and why do cultural ideas, practices, and innovations change or disappear over time? So our first topic, topic 3.1, is our introduction to culture. Our enduring understanding is that cultural practices vary across geographical locations because of physical geography and available resources. Our learning objective is to define the characteristics, attitudes, and traits that influence geographers when they study culture. So when we think about geographers who are studying culture, we think about some areas that geographers are going to actually focus on. First and foremost, our essential knowledge is that culture comprises the shared practices, technologies, attitudes, and behaviors transmitted by a society. Cultural traits, such as those things like food preferences, architecture, and land use, are some of the items that geographers will study to try to identify where a culture might exist. And then we have two different ideas about cultural differences, right? Cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. So with our cultural traits and food preferences that geographers can study, when we think about the global traits and global trends in food preferences, we sometimes see a growth in meat and fresh fruit and veggie options as development occurs, right? A greater demand for meat products, right? So it's not like people weren't eating meat before, it's just as economic development occurs, they can eat more of it, and it becomes a larger part of their diet. We also see when development occurs is sometimes people will abandon some of those dietary staples as different foods become available locally, right? So through commodity change and trading with other countries, we might see, this clashing of, a different style of food and different food preferences that occur, and those more local food preferences maybe taper off a little bit and become less prevalent. So when we think about food preferences, grains as a staple of a diet. We think about rice in Southwest, South, and East Asia. We think about wheats in Europe, Southwest Asia, and North America, right? So these are the areas where wheats are prominent. Corn in Latin America, and then millet and sorghum, two, again, different grain varieties that exist in the continent of Africa, really sub-Saharan Africa, if we're thinking about it more particularly, right, with a wheat more in North Africa. With our meats and meat preferences, in Mediterranean areas or coastal areas, oftentimes we see diets that are very rich in fishes, right, and seafood in general, because they have access to the oceans, and ocean is part of that culture of seafaring and fishing as a cultural norm. For cattle, we see that kind of as the prevalence for our meat preference in Europe, in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe not necessarily for the meat in sub-Saharan Africa, as we see some groups of people use it for milk or for blood from the animal as well, but it's also used for meat. And then in North America and in Latin America, cattle and beef is the go-to. Lamb we usually see in the Mediterranean areas, especially in Greece, right, and in most mountainous regions. So we think about also the physical environment that's available to us. Cattle kind of require open plains, flat land, right? They're not very good at walking up mountains, whereas lamb and goat would be really, really good for mountainous regions where they are suitable to climbing those areas and walking in those regions. With veggies and fruits, honestly, it really depends upon locally available products. As development occurs, you can get different types of veggies and different types of fruits that can be shipped into your country. But we have to think about the climate and climatic variations that could adjust the types of fruits and the types of vegetables that are available to people. So some of the prominent ones that we see, dates and grapes, are in the Mediterranean region. We see pineapple, mango, right, our tropical regions. We can think of like apples. The apple tree is kind of prominent and prevalent throughout the United States. Oranges, a little bit more temperate for oranges. We think about Florida, right? So it's not fully tropical, but it's closer to a temperate area for those types of things. And then with our veggies, where you think of like potatoes in mountainous regions and colder regions, our tubers or our plants that can grow underground are going to happen in colder regions and mountainous regions. And those vegetables that grow above ground, so potatoes, carrots, right, those things, and those veggies that grow above ground are going to be in more temperate regions with less cold because they could die off with that freeze, okay? Cultural traits for architecture. So when we think about architecture, right, it's the building and construction of buildings, whether those are holy places, whether those are houses, just regular houses that people are living in, businesses, whatever the case may be, right? All of those architectural forms. The most common building materials globally are brick and lumber, right? So wood and brick. When we think about folk cultures, and those are those, homogenous group of people, very isolated, usually rural locations. They're going to use what's locally available and prevalent in that area. But as globalization of culture occurs and as economic development occurs, we see local traditions in architecture start to fade as well. So you might be picking up on this trend that as globalization occurs and people are interacting with one another, we see these folk cultures start to maybe wane and die out a bit in terms of the prevalence, whereas this global popular culture seeps in and starts to overtake in all different forms. So when we think about East Asia and some of the architectural features that are notable in sort of that traditional architecture in East Asia, usually courtyards in kind of the middle of a building, symmetry. You have gabled roofs. So if we look at up here, you have a roof line, and then that arch, not arch, but that triangle formation up here is a gable, right? So that is very traditional in East Asian architecture. And then tiled roofs that that usually kind of turn up at the edges. In Southwest Asia and North Africa, we're oftentimes looking at adobe brick structures for houses. And when we think about our holy places, we're thinking about minarets, big minarets on towers of mosques, symmetry as well, right? No depictions of Muhammad, but tile work, that type of stuff. In Europe, right, some of those prominent architectural features and some of those bigger, structures, not really houses or anything. You have domes and arches and columns, and then these various traditions that the European continent went through, like Gothic, a classical kind of going back to the arches and the columns of Rome and Greece. But when we think about everyday buildings, not these mega structures that are holy or important for people, usually it's just going to be whatever was available to the people in that area, right? And so if it's a grassland, people are going to use sod. If it's a desert, they're going to make bricks out of the sand and clay mixtures. So another way that we look at and study cultures is the way that we use land, and that's what we term land use, right? So again, as development occurs, economic development occurs, we oftentimes see changes in the way that people are using the land. Traditionally, agricultural societies moving into industrial societies and then moving into service-based societies is what we think about with the progression of development. And so that's really going to change the way that we're actually using our land with major implications, right? As we transition from a society where majority of people are farmers and they're performing our agriculture, we're really thinking about stepping out of that and starting to use that land for different purposes. So we're going to use less land for agricultural purposes as we economically develop, and more of that land is going to be devoted to urban spaces, whether that is buildings and construction of like central business districts, urban hearths, or if that is with suburbanization and residential facilities for people to live in, right? But then it's all of those things that come with urbanization, right? Infrastructure of road, rail, piping, right? Electrical works, so power lines, right? Just buildings in general. For commercial and residential, they begin to expand, and we see this sprawl of the urban settlement into what once was rural space or agricultural space. And as that sprawl occurs, we need more of the infrastructure to support people who live out there as well. So again, two ideas that we have with reference to culture is cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism is this idea that, we have cultural norms and attitudes, people's beliefs about what we should be doing, what is right and wrong morally, and we should only judge those cultural norms and those attitudes based upon the context and norms of the group being studied. So I shouldn't bring my own perspective into judging their norms and their attitudes about life. I should use their understanding of the world and context to judge and make moral qualms. When we think about it academically, and there is a debate within academics here that could lead to an extreme belief that there are no universal truths or attitudes among human populations when we think about cultural relativism and everything is permissible. That is a very far extreme when we think about cultural relativism, right? And I think it's a fringe group of people who may actually hold on to that. The opposite end of that spectrum is ethnocentrism. It's the belief that your own cultural norms and attitudes are better than everybody else's. And so you can judge other people's cultural values based upon the belief that your own is the best. And so you'll be able to, again, kind of look at this cartoon here on the left, where this individual is saying that illegal migrants are destroying the country as he is wheeling around in this shopping cart that is motorized. So topic 3.2, the cultural landscape. Our enduring understanding is that cultural practices vary across geographical locations because of physical geography and available resources. Learning objective number 1, we're going to describe characteristics of cultural landscape. And learning objective number 2, we're going to explain how the landscape features and land and resource use reflect cultural beliefs and identities. Essential knowledge number 1 goes with the learning objective number 1. Cultural landscapes are combinations of physical features, agricultural and industrial practices, religious and linguistic characteristics, evidence of sequent occupancy, and other expressions of culture, including traditional and postmodern architecture and land use patterns. So agricultural and industrial practices. The thing that we need to keep in mind is when we get back to our agriculture unit, knowing where the location of these agricultural practices occur can help us understand the cultural landscape in that region as well. So it's very important to kind of marry these two ideas and these concepts together once we get back to agriculture. So in slash and burn agriculture, we're looking at kind of this cultural landscape over here on the right in the kind of blurry photo that I probably should have picked a better one of. Part of the cultural landscape is how we're using the land, and using the land in slash and burn requires that we cut down vegetation, burn it, and then use that land to grow crops on. So we have a very prominent look of slash and burn in these regions, right, where you have a portion of the earth that has been scorched. And it is something that is prevalent in usually tropical regions where there's not enough nutrients in the soil, and we have to actually add the nutrients in by burning the vegetation and then tilling the soil. So that occurs in places in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Pastoral nomadism. Usually when we think about pastoral nomadism, this is our picture up here in the top left. We're thinking about individuals who are, they're raising animals, and the animal is going to be dependent on where I am in the world, right? So very similar to what I talked about previously, cattle in flat plains, when we're thinking about hilly or mountainous regions, lamb, goat, etc. So pastoral nomadism also occurs in areas that are arid or too dry for proper, sedentary lifestyle, where you can kind of grow crops over and over and over, from year to year to year, and it requires that you're raising the animals for your food, and they just have the prairies and the grasslands where they can kind of graze. So we also see that in desert areas like North Africa, in Southwest Asia, and then also in the steppes of Central Asia. When we think about rice-dominant subsistence agriculture, what we oftentimes see in the cultural landscape are the terracing, right? Because these rice fields require wet, paddies for the rice to be growing in. And so it requires that we have this steppe or terracing that occurs in our landscape, and that's prevalent in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. So that's more of our subsistence agriculture. When we think about commercial agriculture, we're thinking about monoculture or commercial grain production. So this photo right here with this tractor, and then also this photo in the bottom, where we just have, it's just all one type of crop in the region. It's all corn, or it's all wheat, or it's all soy. And this really is prevalent in the US Midwest and in portions of Central Europe. Livestock ranching, right? This is where we're raising animals not to feed ourselves, but to be sold for meat for other countries, usually for export if it's in Latin America. And we think about the U.S. Southwest as cattle ranchers, right? Texas, that type of thing. But Latin America, southern portions of Brazil, northern Argentina, especially this region called Patagonia, and the Amazon in that region is being cleared to create space for grazing, especially in Brazil. The other thing that we see is mixed crop and livestock. So if you remember back to sustainable, they had the guinea hogs. That's where they were mixing their crops. They were able to take leftover crop and feed it to the livestock, use the livestock byproduct, poop, as fertilizer in the next season. And that is a growing trend in the U.S. Northwest and in the Plain States. The other thing we need to keep about with agricultural practices are plantation style economies and plantation agriculture, where typically it is going to be monoculture as well, but this is where you're focusing on a specialty crop solely to be exported to other countries. A lot of tropical areas, Latin America, the equatorial region, so tropical fruits, coffee, you think pineapples, mango, etc., right, where it's just a big farm, all of pineapples, and those are picked and then shipped off to places where people want to have pineapple. So agricultural and industrial practices kind of continued. When we think about industry, industrial regions, when we're thinking about manufacturing as the center of economic activity, they oftentimes have these very large manufacturing facilities and factories. And so we can see a couple of images of these on the left and in the middle here, where you have these giant facilities that are going to have jobs for thousands of people. But it's also going to include not just the facility itself, but other byproducts that occur in the natural landscape and the physical landscape, smog, water and soil pollution that occur. That's all impacting what we are seeing in our cultural landscape. And then the opposite of this, when we see deindustrialization occur, we have brownfields. These are these abandoned industrial zones or derelict areas. We see urban blight or manufacturing blight is what we call it. So that's that image up here in the top left, where this factory has been abandoned, and we can see that an old area that was probably a parking lot has now been kind of overtaken by weeds and grasses. And then we think about post-industrial eras and regions. Sometimes what we see is this old building on the left-hand side, the top left-hand side. We'll see some places kind of convert those spaces that used to be factory or manufacturing into other uses. And so we think of Ponce City Market in Atlanta as a prime example of that. It is now a facility where people live. It's a facility where there are jobs, where they can, eat, they can, enjoy meals with one another, they can shop. You have apartments on the top levels. So it's an eat, work, and play facility. Religious and linguistic characteristics of the cultural landscape. So knowing the locations of these religious traditions and languages kind of serves as a base for understanding of the cultural landscape. So when we think about that, we have to know, that certain religions hold very unique architectural features, and languages can be presented in the landscape through things like signs. So the names of businesses, place names, billboard, advertisements, etc., etc. So when we think about religions, Islam is prevalent in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and I'll go through each of these and talk about unique characteristics individually as well. Christianity prevalent in Europe and the Americas, and we can break those down into further denominations if we want to. Buddhism in East and Southeast Asia, Hinduism in India, and then Judaism in Israel, North America, and Europe. So, religious features. When we think about prevalent religious features in Islam, we're seeing minarets, we're seeing symmetry, so that's that top picture here, and tile work with Arabic script especially, right? So we can't show the Prophet Muhammad, and so oftentimes the ways around and the ways to create beauty in mosques and religious features is through this symmetry. With Christianity, if we look at aerial photography of cathedrals, especially older cathedrals and older churches, they're in the shape of a cross oftentimes, right? We would see saints and stained glass windows, a crucifix somewhere. Gargoyles are prevalent, right, to ward off spirits as well. In Buddhism, what we see are domes or a stupa, oftentimes a Buddha statue. Again, symmetry, gold and red, kind of prevalent colors that exist in a lot of regions as well. With linguistic features, We look at these former colonized regions. They will also bear the features of their former colonizers linguistically. So we think about India, it's going to have English. French is going to be in North Africa as two examples. But when we get back to colonization and political geography, maybe we can make that connection more readily. So linguistic features in the cultural landscape. Arabic is going to be found in Southwest Asia and North Africa. And we can see that sign up on the top there. Our Roman alphabet, right, the alphabet that we use in in the United States, right, is going to be prevalent in Western Europe and the Americas. The Cyrillic alphabet is going to be in Eastern Europe. Chinese, obviously, is going to be prevalent in China, and Japanese is going to be prevalent in Japan. So we have Chinese over here on the right and Japanese there on the bottom. So when we look at the map of different languages and symbols that are being used, we can again see the prevalence of Arabic in the Middle East, even into Central Asia, right, where Islam is prevalent as well, and North Africa. We see the Roman alphabet or the Latin alphabet over here in all of these kind of tealish locations. Again, the Cyrillic alphabet in Eastern Europe, and then we have all of these other scripts that are kind of interspersed as well. Logographs being essentially symbols represent words rather than symbols representing sounds. So another idea that we have with cultural landscape is the idea of sequent occupancy. And essentially what we mean by sequent occupancy is that there are additions to the landscape that are made by subsequent occupants, by people who are living in that space, right? And every single new generation of people who live in that space, whether they lived there originally or they moved into that region, will add something else to the cultural landscape, and they'll add new forms to their cultural landscape. So I've chosen two examples here. We have the ancient Greek forms in the Acropolis, right? And so you can see that structure way up here on the mountain, right? We have the ancient Egyptian forms in the cultural landscape in the pyramids of Giza, and then kind of in the foreground in the Greek one and then the background of the Egyptian one, right, we can see these modern structures that exist. And that's because the occupants have decided how we need to be building things, right? People in Egypt aren't continuing to build the same way that they built in the past with these mega structures in terms of pyramids. People in Greece, right, and all of these modern buildings aren't building giant mega structures in the Acropolis, but we can see it in the landscape in that sense. For maybe a little less prevalent in terms of big religious features like that, we can think just people coming into the United States of America and Western Europeans coming into the Americas, right, and adding to the landscape things that were not there from indigenous groups. Traditional architectural forms as well are prevalent. They vary from place to place. Again, I kind of went over this previously. East Asia, we have tiled roofs, gables, curved roof lines. In Europe, we have classical, Romanesque, we have Gothic designs, but those are major structures, and residential buildings would be simple and functional. That said, some of these residential structures also adhere to typical belief systems of the people that are building them. So incorporating religious components and superstitions like gargoyles or a sacred orientation along cardinal points could also be found through traditional architecture. And then in our wonderful little bullets there, we have to go over postmodern architecture. So modern architecture focused on this idea of function over aesthetic, and postmodernism came back to the idea that our structures and our buildings should also not just serve a purpose and not just have functionality as the center point, but also some sort of aesthetic to it. And we want to revitalize architecture in that way. So what we saw oftentimes in the modernist movement for architecture is that they would sometimes destroy or create new facades. So they would take out what used to exist and create a new facade or a new look to create this new modern functional approach. But postmodernism was a response to that. They said, you know what, we need buildings that don't just serve a purpose, but also have this good look to them. And so, we have these unique aesthetics that can move from generation to generation and go over time. We have these geese up on the top of this building in the bottom right-hand corner. We have geometric forms in the one here on the right. We have this weird looking arch, dome, column, guy spitting out water fountain up in the top one. Again, very unique aesthetics that come from postmodernism. Those are all essential knowledge number one. Essential knowledge number two is that attitudes towards ethnicity and gender, including the role of women in the workforce, ethnic neighborhoods, and indigenous communities and lands, help shape the use of space in a given society. So when we think about attitudes towards ethnicity, the easiest way for us to see this kind of in the landscape is if we have attitudes towards an ethnicity that are exclusionary, that will often result in those ethnicities being forced to cluster in single spaces. And when that occurs, we have the result of ethnic enclaves, or what we call ethnic neighborhoods, like Little Italy or Chinatown or V-Town or Koreatown or whatever other town you want to add. And this is where a large concentration of one ethnic group lived in a new location, and as such started to build their own traditions into the landscape, right? So again, sequent occupancy. So when we think about some of these traditions that we have, a minyan is a traditional count of 10 Jewish adults that are required for religious obligations to be fulfilled, and more orthodox and traditional interpretations of this oftentimes say it's only men that are allowed to be a part of this 10 Jewish adults. In the United States, right, the women in the military, women were excluded from combat roles until 2013. And so we think about women serving in military in the United States of America, and they were not allowed to have any sort of roles in combat until 2013. Another prevalent feature that we see in traditional societies are things called menstrual sheds. And these are locations in the world where if a woman is on her cycle, right, she is on her period, they are forced to sleep and to live segregated from the rest of society while they are on their cycle, right? So until that cycle is over, they are living in oftentimes locations that don't have electric, don't have plumbing, don't have heating, right? It's very poor conditions, and they're excluded from engaging with the rest of society because it's seen as dirty or unclean. And then prevalent one that we hear more about in the news, Saudi Arabia, right? Again, attitudes towards gender and this very traditional fundamental understanding of religion as saying that, women can't drive. In some instances, women are not allowed to leave the home without male approval or a male escort. Indigenous communities and lands, I'll cover Canada and the United States. But really what we're talking about with indigenous communities go all the way back to land rights and treaties between indigenous communities and the states. And they typically will have various impacts upon how people are using space. In the United States, we think about indigenous lands that have been reduced significantly through successive generations. We see in the top picture there, these are kind of the remnants of reservations that exist in the continental United States. And currently what we're seeing in the United States are indigenous groups that are engaged in legal battles to include hunting and fishing rights in locations, jurisdiction over territories and sovereignty over their own people, and then land use within these territories, right? So if we're thinking about some of the more prevalent recent events and current events in the United States, we're thinking about building of pipelines or access to natural resources, oil, natural gas, in areas that historically have existed in Native American communities and indigenous communities, or have been part of their sacred spaces, their holy locations. And so when we think about all of these battles that are occurring legally, each of the decisions has an impact upon who controls the land and how that land is going to be used within these indigenous communities, right? Are indigenous communities going to have sovereignty over the spaces in these regions? Will they be able to hold courts that are distant from and distinct from federal courts in the United States of America? These are prevalent issues that are happening in the indigenous communities in the United States. And then in Canada, in an effort to kind of answer some of those same questions, they created a new territory called Nunavut in 1999 and essentially ceded over land use rights. So harvesting, water management, heritage preservation, natural resource rights in this territory were ceded from Canada to Indigenous groups in the community. Topic 3.3, cultural patterns. Cultural practices vary across geographical locations because of physical geography and available resources. Weird. Learning objectives. Explain patterns and landscapes of language, religion, ethnicity, and gender. So regional patterns of language, religion, and ethnicity contribute to a sense of place, enhance placemaking, and shape the global cultural landscape. And then language, ethnicity, and religion are factors in creating centripetal and so when we think about sense of place and placemaking, we're talking about building of meaning and importance into our societies. And there's a really good song that'll sum up what it means when we think about the United States of America and suburbia kind of losing this unique feature. So it's about a 2-minute song, so it'll be a little reprieve from listening to me talk.
Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a green one and a pink one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same. And the people in the house all went to the university where they were put in boxes and they came out all the same. And there's doctors and lawyers and business executives, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same. And they all play on the golf course and drink their martinis dry, and they all have pretty children, and the children go to school, and the children go to summer camp, and then to the university where they are put in boxes and they come out all the same. And the boys go into business and marry and raise a family in boxes made of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. There's a green and a pink and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same.
So again, Malvina Reynolds, Little Boxes, again, a good song about suburbia and this idea that in the United States, we maybe have lost a sense of place as residential areas all look exactly the same. Our architecture in each neighborhood is exactly the same as the architecture next door to us. And that we've maybe lost this sense of belonging and, this sense of shared meaning in the places that we visit and that we live in. Centripetal and centrifugal forces. So centripetal forces unite people within a location. It makes them feel a stronger sense of unity and feel togetherness. And centrifugal forces divide people within a location. Causes divisions, make people feel less similar, less alike. Language, religion, and ethnicity can all play a part in this, and it really depends upon the context of the world in the locations that we're talking about. So in terms of language, we think about language diversity being a centrifugal force, and communication problems can cause people to feel divided, right? India has 22 official languages on the books where the laws and governance have to be done in 22 different languages. They have 122 what is classified as major languages, right? So a large population actually speaking it in the tens of thousands, and then 1,599 other languages, which may be dialects, but they may be different languages as well. Other prime examples of this, we think of Canada and French-speaking Canada, where it's causing friction between these two peoples who have lived in this location for a very long time. That said, language can also be a unifying force. If we're thinking about, in one of the languages in India that is official is English, right? It is a lingua franca. It is this language that all people, might be able to share, I say that, if they are in the legislative bodies and if they are in governance. They might be able to share that language with one another. But in terms of uniting the people within India, probably not as much. Religious differences. So religious strife and religious difference is often a centrifugal force. When we think about all of the conflicts that we've studied in human geo, in Sudan, in Yugoslavia, in India, in the Kashmir region, right, in Ireland versus Northern Ireland, Israel and Palestine, we're looking at groups of individuals who held very different religious beliefs from one another. And oftentimes what we see is that this sense of religious difference coincided with claims to territory, and that made it even more volatile in that region. And then ethnicity, we saw very similar situations in some of the locations that we were talking about with the religion. But ethnic differences can also cause division among populations. So in Yugoslavia, you had the Serbs and the Croatians, right? You had the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. In Myanmar, you have the Rohingya who were forced out of Myanmar. And then in China, you have the Uyghur population that's being kind of subjugated in western portions of China. The thing to keep in mind is that while differences may act as centrifugal forces that are dividing people in these locations, oftentimes when we see homogeneity in these locations, it might unite people or cause them to feel a sense of togetherness. Topic 3.4, the types of diffusion. The interactions of people contributes to the spread of cultural practices, and in our learning objective, it's just going to be define the type of diffusion. So our essential knowledge is that relocation expansion, including contagious hierarchical and stimulus diffusion, are all types of diffusion. So I'm just going to stay on this slide. And our definition for relocation diffusion is that physical movement of a population takes the cultural traits and practices with them. It does not lead to an increase in numbers. It is just when people take their stuff and move from one location to a new location. We have relocated where those cultural practices exist. Expansion diffusion is this umbrella term that we give for diffusion where numbers increase as time progresses. So more and more and more people are participating in a cultural trend or a cultural pattern. Contagious diffusion is a type of expansion diffusion. It's when this cultural trait or idea spreads from person to person via direct interaction, face-to-face communication, or indirect interaction, things like internet followers. Hierarchical diffusion is when this cultural trait or idea spreads from people or places of importance down the spectrum of importance to less important locations. Or we can also think of the opposite of that, reverse hierarchical, which is where it started in some place that was very unlikely to have importance and then moved up the spectrum to places of importance. Walmart is a great example of that. And then finally, stimulus expansion or stimulus diffusion is when the underlying principle spreads, but it is adjusted to other purposes or local needs. So the idea of an operating system for a computing device or a cell phone spreads, and different companies then adjusted it using different coding languages or different operating systems like iOS versus Android, right? Or using Python versus HTML. Right? The same principle is there. It's something that's going to allow the computer to read that language and then transition it and change it so that people can actually interact with it. It's been changed though for needs and purposes of that company or in situations of that location. Topic 3.5, the historical causes of diffusion. Cultural ideas, practices, innovations change or disappear over time as our enduring understanding, and our learning objective is to explain how historical processes impact current cultural patterns. Our essential knowledge, interactions between and among cultural traits and larger global forces can lead to new forms of cultural expression. For example, creolization, lingua franca. Colonialism, imperialism, and trade helped to shape. So creolization and lingua franca, these are two terms that we use within language. Creolization occurs when two groups of people speak different languages, interact, and we see a blending of the two languages into a new language. So again, first, these two groups start to construct that new language, a pidgin language. And this is a blending of the two different distinct languages into what is a new language. Once that new language is the primary language for a generation, they don't really remember the older distinct languages that used to exist. We then say that language has been creolized. It is a Creole language. So, you know, Haitian Creole, wow, if I could say words, funny because I'm talking about words, is a Creole language, right? It came from African tradition and from French, and blending those two things together created a new language. A lingua franca, on the other hand, is a language that is used between people who do not speak the same language, and oftentimes it's used for trade. So we take a situation where, you know, you have two separate groups of individuals. You know, one person who, India, again, I'll go back to that as the prime example with centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. The British colonized in India, in South Asia, right? So you might have people who are speaking Hindi or, you know, other Indo-European languages, or you might have people speaking a Dravidian language in India, and they're not mutually intelligible. People can't understand each other if they're speaking these different languages in India. However, they might both know English, and these two people might use English in order to communicate with each other. And so the reason why we're seeing English as the world's lingua franca is because of some of those historical factors like British colonization, American corporate dominance globally, or American military might. When we think about the military spreading all over the world after World War II and us having bases everywhere, that's helping to spread English. When we think about in Latin America, oftentimes indigenous groups, they might use Spanish as the lingua franca. And so we can think about English as a global lingua franca, and then regionally we might see lingua francas that are different from the one that is being used at the global scale. So colonialism and imperialism, two terms that kind of help us to understand some of the practices that occur and linguistic characteristics of the world and religious practices of the world as well. Colonialism is when we resettle a population to a territory controlled by a foreign power, right? It requires that resettling of a people, whereas imperialism just means we're controlling that space without resettling the population. So when we think about this map over here to the left, this is when empires were growing, and in 1945 we can kind of see the extent of the empires that existed in terms of dominance of the world. That helps to imprint language, architectural forms, religious beliefs, and governmental and political structures all over the world. And so we think about North Africa, people in northwestern portions of Africa are speaking French, African people speaking French because the French colonized that region and they had empires in that region. We think about people in South Asia speaking English, well, it's because the British colonized that area and spread to that region. So items that were left out when we think even more historical than you know, the 1900s. When the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire were burgeoning, they kind of came much earlier than these other empires that came later. You know, Spain took most of Latin America, and Portugal got most of Brazil, and we can see that imprint in Latin America in Spanish language and in Roman Catholicism. We can see Portugal, right, the Portuguese colonizing and taking over Brazil, and what is today modern day Brazil, and a lot of people there being, again, Roman Catholic speaking Portuguese. We don't really see a lot of territory for Germany or German colonization here because they lost most of their empire post World War I. Same with Japan, right? They were starting to build their empire in East Asia prior to World War II. They lose World War II, and so the influence wanes in East Asia as well. The last bit that we talk here, trade. Trade routes saw the relocation, then expansion of languages, religions, cultural traits as people interacted culturally as well as economically. So we kind of see the Roman Empire, the Silk Road through Han China, the Kushan Empire and the Parthian Empire, When we think about trade, especially historically, we can kind of see how both conquest and trade aided in the spread of, the Roman alphabet or the Latin language, the spread of Buddhism into portions of China and East Asia, the spread of Hinduism into Southeast Asia, which would then again be replaced by Buddhism. So trade routes can also play a really, really significant role in the spread of ideas. So again, the Romance languages are the remnants of the Roman Empire, which also aided in the spreading of Christianity later. The Silk Roads aided in the spreading of Buddhism into East Asia. Arabian trade and conquest. So later, these trade routes might be shut a little bit, but we see Arabic spreading into North Africa, into Southwest Asia through these trade routes. Europeans, thinking we want teas and spices that used to flow on the Silk Road. Now we need to colonize these locations. The Columbian exchange in terms of trade, bringing food from Europe to the Americas and the Americas to Europe. All of these are evidence of trade and how it impacted the movement of ideas and traits. Topic 3.6, contemporary causes of diffusion. Same enduring understanding there. And then explain how historical processes impact current cultural patterns. Our essential knowledge, cultural ideas and practices are socially constructed and changed through both small-scale and large-scale processes such as urbanization and globalization. These processes come to bear on culture through media, technological change, politics, economics, and social relationships. And then communication technologies such as the internet and time-space convergence are reshaping and accelerating interactions among people, changing cultural practices as the increasing use of English and the loss of indigenous languages, and in creating cultural convergence and divergence. So when we think about culturally constructed cultural norms and values, we can start with race. It is a social construct that classifies people based upon their outward biological appearances. So your hair, your skin color, facial shapes, etc. We think about socially constructed cultural norms and values related to gender, right? Social construct classifying the behaviors that are associated with biological sex. We can classify things based on the heteronormative, the idea that places value on what society classifies as normal sexual behavior and abnormal sexual behavior. For most societies, that normal is heterosexual. Technology uses, right? So social constructs related to technology use. We can think about there are different views on the use of technology that vary from place to place around the world. The Amish view some technologies as a threat to their way of life, the very core of their being, right? And then this process of othering that usually happens from all of these social constructs. Othering is a sociological view that people in groups, both large and small, will notice differences in people that belong in different groups, the other. That then can reinforce what it means to be a part of my own group. They, the other, all look or act in a certain way, and we, belonging to our group, look and act in a different way. And through this process, we can kind of reinforce the differences and reinforce the norms and values of our own society. So when we think about each of these kind of constructs, urbanization, typically what happens with urbanization is that people are going to have interactions with different groups on a more regular basis. And when this happens, we have two different kind of responses to it. We have integration of populations and acceptance of people based on gender norms, racial differences, heterosexuality or homosexuality, or we have segregation, where people are not accepting of those differences. So when we see the segregation, we oftentimes see ethnic neighborhoods. We saw it in apartheid in South Africa. We saw it in US segregation policies in Jim Crow. But we can also see it in that kind of integration form where you have neighbors that are from different religious backgrounds or different sexual preferences, and people are more accepting generally in more urban locations. The other thing that we see as well with urbanization and urban populations is that they are typically those with greater access to economic wealth, which also kind of plays a part in what they are able to do in terms of their use of technology or their access to technology. So with that economic potential, we oftentimes will gain access to newer or broader forms of media, usually through technology or material goods, right? So radio, television, satellite, internet. As we become more urban, as we become wealthier, we also get access to new forms of media through these new technologies, which will also help us to learn about and spread, new ideas further and wider than before. The other thing that we see in this process is globalization, right? The idea that a large process covers the entire globe. And again, as societies become more connected to the rest of the world, what we're oftentimes seeing is a clash between our local folk cultures and a global popular culture in relation to, again, linguistic practices, racial differences, gender norms and stereotypes, religious beliefs, and et cetera, et cetera. Cultural preservation attempts are rising in some sense, where you see these cultures that feel as if they are under threat from this external process that exists due to globalization. And it's oftentimes a response to that in order to try to retain one's culture and one's beliefs. So when we think about media in this sense, and we're not talking like news media, we're talking media in every form, movies, songs, television, internet, right? These oftentimes are controlled by the most developed parts of the world. So Japan in South Korea in East Asia, the West for a lot of the places in the world. Britain has kind of BBC and their global networks. The United States has CNN and Fox News as their global networks. And that spreads our cultural norms and values throughout the rest of the world. And when we think about what's happening as people in less developed countries gain access to these new media forms through development, they're inundated by Western media and Western influence and economic influence and cultural influence, not oftentimes their own. All right, in terms of politics and economics, when we think about the global culture and cultural forms being spread, typically those are originating in economically developed countries. So kind of just reinforcing what I said on the previous slide there. That sometimes becomes economic might, corporate power and ownership of media exists in those economically dominant regions. And because of this, those economic dominant regions oftentimes also dominate the world politically in terms of supranational organizations like the UN and militaristically. And so when we think about the types of media that's being spread around the world, types of culture that's being spread around the world, that is coming from economically dominant regions, but it's also that corporate influence, right? So that influences food structures and food habits of individuals moving away from traditional customs of food and eating into maybe a more fast food type of diet and dietary customs. But also it spreads political influence globally as well, in terms of like the only type of political entity that could exist, or the best type of political entity that exists, is a democratic institution, right? With a federal level government, something like that. And so what we oftentimes see is this attempt to export democracy and political institutions that are built on these Western forms, where it may not be suitable for the people or the regions where it is going to, because of these centrifugal forces that exist within that location. Right? There may not be enough of a shared bond or unity among a population to export democracy and political institutions in these Western forms to those regions. Internet technologies, space-time convergence also impact the way that we kind of interact and culture is being shaped. As people around the world are interacting with the internet and gaining access to the internet, they also gain access to new forms of social relationships, new ideas, and the ability to share their own stories. So we think especially about locations in North Africa, Southwest Asia, during what we termed the Arab Spring, right? This is individuals who were posting their stories of what was happening in the Arab world at the time, again, calling for greater democratic principles at that moment in regions where they felt as if they were ready for it. And the response coming from their states that were kind of repressive or repressive of that movement. That also says, when we say space-time convergence, we're talking about this idea that we are reducing the amount of time it takes to cover space. That's what space-time convergence means. And when we think about faster, reliable internet connections, it allows these ideas to spread much more rapidly than they did in the past. In terms of English spreading as the global lingua franca, what we're seeing oftentimes is it spreading and putting at risk indigenous languages around the world. And so when we think about historic evidence of English becoming that lingua franca, right, British colonization, economic power, and contemporary reasons why English is dominant, internet and other technologies, economic power, media, those things are all spreading English around the globe, and it's meaning that English is the world's lingua franca. And because of that, what we're seeing in response is a lot of these localities trying to say, you know, our language is just as important to us. It is meaningful to us. It is our culture. Our language is part of our culture. It's part of who we are as a people, and we want to preserve that language. And so endangered languages like Hawaiian and Welsh, they use traditional methods to try to recreate and hold on to their languages through storytelling, passing the language down from generation to generation. But they're also kind of taking advantage of the spread of internet and new technologies to you know, put dictionaries online, to record videos of people speaking the language, to create media, songs, poetry, right, literature in that form and post it online. They're also educating people in order to preserve their language for future generations so that it doesn't die out. And so when we think about that idea of you know, globalization and technology and you know, topic 3.7, diffusion of religion and language. Language objective is that we're going to explain what factors lead to the diffusion of universalizing and ethnic religion. So our essential knowledge: language families, languages, dialects, world religions, ethnic cultures, and gender roles diffuse from cultural hearths. Diffusion of language families, including Indo-European and religious patterns and distributions, can be visually represented on maps and charts and toponyms and other representations. Religions have distinct places of origin from which they diffuse to other locations through different processes, practices, and belief systems impacted how widespread the religion diffused. Universalizing religions, including Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Sikhism, are spread through expansion and relocation diffusion, and ethnic religions, including Hinduism and Judaism, are generally found near the hearth or spread through relocation diffusion. So our linguistic hearths or origin points, these are oftentimes hard to identify. It's very difficult for linguists to think where has a language started, because essentially language has existed long before a written record. So in some instances, if there's no written record for a language, it's all oral tradition, we don't really know where it began. But there are some ideas and theories about linguistic hearths and origin points broadly for different language families. So our Indo-European language family, there are two different theories, competing theories. One is that it started in Southwest Asia, and the other is that it started in Central Asia. The Southwest Asian population was one that was agricultural society, and then it spread and diffused from there. And the Central Asian one was that it was a you know, a nomadic group of individuals that were warriors and spread through conquest. The Sino-Tibetan languages started in East Asia. There's really no kind of qualms about that one. The Niger-Congo differentiation of A and B started in western portions of Africa. And again, the B group, the Bantu migration, you should learn about that in world history, spread through portions of, you know, Western Africa down into portions of Central and South Africa. The Afro-Asiatic languages, Eastern or Northeastern Africa, are the origin points for the Afro-Asiatic languages. Religious hearths. So we'll go over the universalizing and the ethnic religion. Christianity in Southwest Asia, Islam in Southwest Asia, Buddhism in South Asia, Sikhism in South Asia, Hinduism in South Asia, and Judaism in Southwest Asia. So a lot of the major and prominent religions of the world today started somewhere in the Asian continent. Universalizing versus ethnic religions, these are two distinctions that we have, and they kind of impact how much they spread and where they spread to. Ethnic religions do not attempt to appeal to people. Right? There's no proselytizing, there's no measure of saying everybody can be a fill in the blank. The beliefs and practices of ethnic religions are insular and really only apply to those people who already belong to the religion, right? And sometimes it's difficult to convert to that religion. So when we think about Judaism, right, the original covenant, the Jewish legal tradition in both written Torah and oral form, make it kind of difficult for non-Jewish individuals to try to convert unless they adhere to Jewish law, or you're Jewish if you come from a Jewish mother. So it's an ethnically passed down religious belief and tradition there. Hinduism, on the other hand, right, there's a wide range of beliefs about God, about the world that exists within Hindu traditions, and there are some modern debates that are occurring around conversion of people to Hinduism, but historically Hinduism and Hindu practices weren't necessarily proselytizing religions. They weren't trying to convert people into the belief system that existed. And when we think about Judaism and Hinduism and other ethnic religions, oftentimes the practices and the holy sites and the holy calendar days, right, the holidays, they center around things that were prominent and prevalent in the region in which that religion came about. So, holy sites are oftentimes parts of the physical landscape that existed in that region. So it wouldn't make sense for me to try to convert people who aren't in that region to have a holy place that's so far away and so meaningless to those people. Universalizing religions, on the other side, they do attempt to appeal to all people. So Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Sikhism, they can attempt to convert actively or have practices and beliefs that allow for conversion fairly easily, right? So when we think about these beliefs and conversion, within Christianity, it's just, you become baptized into the religion, whatever, denomination that may be, and that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and is God. For Islam and for conversion into Islam, right, the very simple statement is, is that you believe that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is the final prophet. And that kind of statement is the conversion process for becoming a Muslim. Buddhism, essentially conversion into Buddhism is that you accept the basic tenets of good behavior of the Five Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And now you are a Buddhist. And then Sikhism, baptism into Sikhism and the acceptance of beliefs about Sikhism in the world. So when we think about the spread of these religions, we start from those hearths, and then we start through time seeing kind of the extent of the spread of Christianity and Islam and other religions. So we think about the hearth in Southwest Asia, right? Modern day Israel for Christianity. It spreads through relocation diffusion. Missionaries would travel through the Roman Empire into Europe. Much later it travels from Spain and Portugal through relocation into the Americas, England and France to the Americas. We also had a hierarchical diffusion that occurred with Christianity. The Roman Emperor Constantine converted and forces kind of the Roman Empire to convert to Christianity. And then contagious forms that kind of happen all over the place with these universalizing religions is spreading from person to person after people have resettled. That could be voluntary, right? Voluntary conversion of people hearing the word of God and Christ and converting, or it also could be through coercion and forced conversion colonies. The spread of Islam, what we see, the hearth is in Southwest Asia, in Mecca, right? So in modern day Saudi Arabia. It does spread through Southwest Asia and North Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia through missionaries and also through conquest. So when we look at hierarchical diffusion, There are various caliphates, right? Caliph being the name of king or emperor, right? So caliphate being kingdom or empire. And so various caliphates would spread and would conquer portions of North Africa, Southwest Asia, and even into Central Asia. So you can see the non-Islamic kingdoms here in Europe. And then you also have contagious diffusion through trade routes going especially into places like Southeast Asia and Indonesia. The spread of Buddhism, much less so in terms of conquest like the other two. When we see its hearth in South Asia, we really see it spread kind of through relocation, diffusion, missionaries and traders along the Silk Roads and traveling in to the interior of China, and then from there kind of converting individuals through contagious diffusion along those same paths. When we think about hierarchical, we can say maybe that some Chinese empires would kind of force it upon groups, especially in western portions of China and portions of like Southeast Asia as they expanded into those regions. Sikhism, it's one of the newer universalizing religions compared to those other three. And so it hasn't spread as much as the other three have, right? It has primarily spread through relocation diffusion into surrounding countries, right? It started in South Asia and in northern portions of India. We can see relocation diffusion is kind of spread through Southeast Asia, right? We have some portions in East Africa here in the United States and Canada. There were some attempts in the 18th century where there was a Sikh state that was established in Punjab, kind of as a response to attempts at spreading of empire in India, and then again when colonization occurred against the British, and then again contagious, very similar to all of the other contagious universalizing religions, where people would just spread the word from here. The spread of Hinduism and Judaism. So what we see, unlike universalizing religions, ethnic religions really only spread via relocation diffusion. Again, there's no attempt to kind of convert people or to try to get people to become a Jew or to become a Hindu. And so we don't really see the spread of these religions outside of people actually relocating who are practicing these religions. So Judaism in its hearth in Southwest Asia, there's spread to Europe. And there are numerous expulsions of Jews from Western European states and migration events returning into European states. We do see a return of Jewish populations to Southwest Asia during the Zionist era and pre and post World War II, and also to the North American continent as well. Hinduism, its hearth is in South Asia. It did spread through trade during the height of the Indian empires, so there was a large population of Hindus that existed in Southeast Asia as well, but that's going to be replaced by Buddhism and Islam much later. So this is a map that we can see the human language families, and I do want to point out some of the notable ones here. The light green one that covers most of the American continent, most of Europe, that is Indo-European, but also this dark green right in here, Indo-Iranian, is also part of the Indo-European language family. And it should not be a separate kind of group right there. And so we can see Indo-European in South Asia, in Europe and Siberia, in the Americas, in Australia, in South Africa, right? So it's almost all over the world. And a lot of that is the legacy of colonization. The Afro-Asiatic languages, right? So Arabic being a large one in that family is North Africa and the middle, what we would call the Middle East or Southwest Asia. Niger Congo, right, is going to be in Central African portions, and again, it's subdivided into A and B. Khoisan, which is onomatopoeia language, is kind of right down here in southern portions of Africa, kind of the remnants of a much more traditional language that's existed there for a very long time. So you kind of look at this and look at all the different language families that exist, Sino-Tibetan here in China for the most part, but also in portions of Southeast Asia. And then we have the spread of religions through a map as well. So you can see Catholicism in mostly Latin America, right? We have Protestant denominations up here in the United States, in Northern Europe, right? Catholics in Southwest, South, and Eastern Europe. We have Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodox in the eastern portions of Europe. We can see Islam spread between Sunni in North Africa and most of the Middle East and Central Asia, and Shia populations in Iran and Iraq, respectively. Hinduism, again, being primarily in India. Judaism being just a little pink little dot right there in the middle of Southwest Asia. And then something to point out here, Buddhism over most of China and Southeast Asia is these like dashed lines that exist in Central Africa here. Again, part of the legacy of colonization as converts in Sub-Saharan Africa to Christianity. Topic 3.8, the effects of diffusion. Our learning objective is to explain how the process of diffusion results in changes to the cultural landscape. So our essential knowledge is that acculturation, assimilation, syncretism, and multiculturalism are effects of the diffusion of culture. And so to differentiate between acculturation and assimilation, both of these are talking about the interaction of people. Acculturation is a process through which people or individuals adopt or adjust to new cultural environments through borrowing cultural traits, norms, and values from other cultures. Typically, the more dominant one, it usually takes place when a new migrant comes to a country and they try to adjust to their new home. However, acculturation allows for the retention of minority traits or values and norms. It's just that they're going to adopt cultural traits of the dominant society in order to integrate. Assimilation, on the other hand, is where an individual adopts all cultural traits of the more dominant group in order to blend in or become similar to the dominant culture, right? It can be voluntary or it can be forced when we think about forcing people to assimilate to religious or linguistic practices, oftentimes in colonized areas. And assimilation, when we think about it, does not really allow for the retention of former traits or values and norms. You have to adopt all of the values and the norms and the attitudes and the beliefs of that dominant culture. Syncretism is this idea that two or more cultures blend ideas, traits, and values to form new ideas and new traits and new values, right? So we think about the spreading of global culture. Maybe we take a little bit of that, but we manifest it in a different way for our own customs and our own beliefs, right? So we can see in McDonald's that around the world may offer different types of foods for people in different locations. And then finally, multiculturalism, just an idea that, how we deal with cultural diversity is kind of the central focus here for multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is a belief that society is benefiting from the acceptance and coexistence with multiple cultures in a society, which means we're going to allow for people to express themselves in the cultural landscape. And that is culture.